Chapter 6, The Street. This is another one of those in-between chapters, which I think a lot of people would throw out, but I just love. There's so many little gems in here, so many little flourishes from Melville that are interesting. So Ishmael walks out into the street, and what we ultimately end up getting is a meditation on the types of people that are living in New Bedford, which is just full of all these different types of people. You can actually see that down here. Fijians, and then he names all these different islands, and Vermonters, and New Hampshiremen. But I like this passage right here. I find it funny. It's about dandies, okay? He talks about people coming from the country versus being in the town. Now, for those of you who don't know, a dandy is a classic 19th century term that means a man unduly devoted to style, neatness, and fashion in dress and appearance. So, we're talking a hipster from Brooklyn or San Francisco who cares a lot about what they're wearing, probably have some skinny jeans, an orange beanie and a flannel shirt, and they drink Pabst Blue Ribbon, and they may or may not look like Mr. Langerman. Totally possible. Not for sure, just possible. And he says something humorous here. He says, no town-bred dandy, okay? No one who grew up in the town, who is also a dandy, will compare with a country-bred one. I mean a downright, what a phrase here, bumpkin dandy, okay? Someone from out the city who is now trying to be cool. A kid from Montana who moves to New York City, okay? A fellow that in the dog days will mow his 2 acres in buckskin gloves for fear of tanning his hands, okay? Someone who's trying to make themselves all fancy, not hard working. Now, when a country dandy like this takes it into his head to make a distinguished reputation and joins the great whale fishery, you should see the comical things he does upon reaching the seaport. In bespeaking, okay, to show evidence of his sea outfits, he orders bell buttons to his waistcoats, straps to his canvas trousers. So these are like ornamental flourishes which are not functional, but rather just for show. But the whale ship is not a place for that, and we're going to find that out. Hence why we have this little yellow passage here, which I can't help but try to connect to our big ideas. Poor hayseed. And if you are curious about hayseed, which I must admit is not particularly obvious, it's a 19th century piece of slang for like rube or hick or fool. You poor hayseed. How bitterly will burst those straps in the first howling gale when thou art driven, straps, buttons and all, down the throat of the tempest. Okay, so for me, I see the connection here to knowledge and truth and understanding as, again, I'm just repeating myself here because we're tracking these ideas across chapters. This one fits into the notion of the importance of subjectivity and perspective. The country dandy doesn't have the knowledge or perspective to understand just how uncaring and how unfeeling something like a tempest will be, a violent windy storm, to his desire for fashion and his perspective on the importance of looking cool. Okay, so it's all about your reference point. And I think, though this is a funny passage about some idiot bringing a Gucci sweater onto a whaling ship and it getting blown off, it also subtly highlights the importance of perspective and subjective positioning on truth. Okay. And because this is a very short chapter, there's only one more big passage to talk about, and it's marked in orange, and it's talking about New Bedford. And I just find this so interesting. Let's start reading from where I started. New Bedford is a land of oil, true enough, but not like Canaan. Of course, Canaan was a land that was cursed. So he's saying, even though Canaan has oil, we've got oil and we're not cursed. A land also of corn and wine. The streets do not run with milk, nor in the springtime do they pave them with fresh eggs. So it's not a utopia. Yet in spite of this, nowhere in all America will you find more patrician-like houses. For those of you who don't know, patrician means aristocratic or wealthy. It comes from the Roman adjective. You'll find more patrician-like houses, parks and gardens more opulent, more fancy than in New Bedford. Whence came they? How planted upon this once scraggy scoria of a country? Okay, scoria being like a molten slag from a volcano. How did we get from a rather non-fertile, non-agriculturally ready piece of land to this very wealthy community? Well, go and gaze upon the iron emblematical harpoons round yonder lofty mansion, and your questions will be answered. Yes, all those brave houses and flowery gardens came from the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. One and all they were harpooned and dragged up hither from the bottom of the sea. Can Herr Alexander perform a feat like that? So, I use this as my opportunity to introduce a thematic concern which many critics see in a very prescient way presented by Melville, which is the environmental concerns about the actions of unrestrained and unregulated capitalism and its relationship to the natural ecosystem. Now, I'm not a tree hugger, so this doesn't, constitute my main concern in the text, but there are certainly moments where the industry of whaling in particular, and just industry in general, get a little bit of a ambiguous treatment from Melville. It's not a celebration of whaling, but it's also not like an explicit moral or parable about how we are violating Mother Earth. Trust me, as we read more, you'll know that's not the case. But nevertheless, this is forcing us to acknowledge a kind of, relationship between prosperity and wealth in the 19th century in these towns and the use of resources from the ocean. And it's a kind of magic, which is why he says, can Herr Alexander perform a feat like this? When I first read that line, I thought he was referring to Alexander the Great, of course, of Macedonia, i.e. this is a feat which is very difficult to do, and Alexander the Great was, of course, known for great feats. But actually, I did some research, and it turns out that Herr Alexander is, I even wrote it down because I could not remember this name, Johann Friedrich Alexander Heimberger. Okay, which it would be very funny if I pretended to know that was the case, but I'm not going to go there. Heimberger, was a famous magician of the day. So it doesn't really change the meaning of the line. He's just saying it's kind of magical that with the impact of industry, we were able to turn what is essentially a useless piece of land into one of the most thriving communities in America. In New Bedford, fathers, they say, give whales for dowers, gifts to the groom, to their daughters, and portion off their nieces with a few porpoises apiece. You must go to New Bedford to see a brilliant wedding, for they say they have reservoirs of oil in every house, and every night recklessly burn their lengths in spermaceti candles. And it's that excessive wealth and excessive use of the candles that brings that slight element of critique into this passage and makes us really question whether the extraction of these natural resources is being used wisely. A far more pressing question in 2020 than in 1851. Finally, I just found this passage interesting in its weirdness. The women of New Bedford, they bloom like their own red roses, but roses only bloom in summer, whereas the fine carnation of their cheeks is perennial as sunlight in the seven heavens. Elsewhere match that bloom of theirs ye cannot, save in Salem, where they tell me the young girls breathe such musk, their sailor sweethearts smell them miles offshore, as though they were drawing nigh the odorous Moluccas instead of the puritanic sands. So I found this passage really weird when I first read it, because it seems to be a comment complimenting the beauty of women of New Bedford, except only to be surpassed by the musk, the strong scent of girls in Salem. So I had to do some research. Why was Salem associated with a strong musk? And the curious answer is that Salem at this time, I believe, was the fourth largest city in America, or maybe only in New England. I need to look up that again. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to pause the record. Yes, I double-checked my notes, and it seems to me that my notes tell me that at the time Salem was the sixth largest city in the United States and was prospering heavily due to the spice trade. And the main spices were like pepper and nutmeg and all the other spices that people were willing to pay a lot of money for was making Salem rich. So that's the connection to the orange stuff above, is that this like seemingly weird comment about the smell of girls in Salem is really about how commerce is starting to transform both America and just society. We're becoming a globally prosperous society due to commerce, whether that is good, bad, or indifferent for the earth. It's a new fact that certainly Melville is interested in pointing out, and he will point out at other moments in the text.